I am Ian and I work in game accessibility. And before that, I have some background in design and UX and across some other industries as well. But I've been working in the field of game accessibility for about 16 years now. And in that time, it has changed beyond all recognition, especially in recent years. There are many things that are taken for granted today that simply did not exist just a few short years ago. So to help us remember where we've come from and see the trajectory we're following, today we're going to start by taking a little stroll through time, taking us through some key moments up to the present day. Game accessibility actually goes all the way back to at least 1950. Bertie the Brain, which is one of the earliest computer games, which is basically a big human versus computer tic-tac-toe machine, actually included configurable difficulty. And the reason for this was thanks to the designer recognizing the need for barriers to flex in line with human variance, which is a core principle that underpins much of today's work. For this presentation, we're just going to cover the past 10 years, so skip ahead to 2012. But if you want to know more about what happens between 1950 and 2012, there will be a link on the last slide. So the past 10 years, what was the landscape like in 2012? It was largely focused around three groups. There were two gamer-focused charities, Special Effects, which had been around since 2007, and Able Gamers, which was founded in 2004. There was also a few handfuls of independent advocates covering developers, gamers, and academics, a group of which had banded together as the IGDA's Accessibility SIG back in 2003. In those days, hardware accessibility was mostly homebrew and hacks. There was very little accessibility awareness or implementation amongst developers, especially in AAAs, which is like the big games with the big teams and the big budgets, with a rare exception being Ubisoft's requirements for subtitling and epilepsy testing that had actually come in 2008. But there were no full-time game accessibility roles anywhere in the industry, and there were widespread negative attitudes from gamers. This is all very different to how things are today. In 2012, two new resources launched. One was called Inclusification, and that was by Able Gamers. The other was GameAccessibilityGuidelines.com, and that was developed by a collaboration of developers, academics, and specialists. These were not the first accessibility guidelines for games, but they were the first two resources to start to gain wide traction with developers, which was a big landmark. Also in 2012, the Warfighter Engaged charity was founded with the goal of using and adapting gaming technology for rehabilitation of service-injured veterans. And I'll be coming back to Warfighter Engaged again once we get to 2018. A game called Die Ontdekker launched. This was an award-winning Wii game, a Dutch game designed for sighted, partially sighted, and blind children to play together. A lengthy forum thread went up on the Ubisoft forums pleading for remapping in the upcoming Assassin's Creed 3. So remapping meaning being able to reassign which button does what on the controller. They never got it. Button remapping didn't arrive in the Assassin's Creed series until Assassin's Creed Origins some years later. But every single reply on that thread was a positive message of support for disabled gamers. So I personally had never seen anything like this before. This felt like a watershed moment at the time, a sign of the shifting understanding and expectations and acceptance from the wider gaming community. Moving on to 2013. In 2013, Injustice became the first AAA game to consider blind gamers. So this is a one-on-one fighting game, like Street Fighter, that kind of thing. Fighting games like that are generally pretty blind accessible. So through a combination of stereo sounds and good sound design, at any given time, you can usually tell exactly where each of the two players are and exactly which move they're pulling off. But Injustice took this further, and the reason why they had to do that was because they added interactive background objects. So like the tree here on the right that Bane is about to reach into the background, rip out and doink Raven over the head with. So because they had this extra information, the developers actually added an option to turn on a simple audio ping when a player is standing in front of an object like that, to ensure that blind players have access to that visual information too. Australia at the time were a leader in game accessibility, and they continued on with their push. They had a new dedicated accessibility award category in their annual Australian Game Development Awards. This is something that would come back with a vengeance in 2020. And in response to a change.org petition by a deaf gamer, Steam, which is one of the main game storefronts, added information to store pages to say whether each game has got subtitles, and also offer the option to filter the store to only show games that have them. A free-to-use game accessibility symbol was developed by Barry Ellis of OneSwitch and has since spread through games, documentation, and events as a standardized way of signifying accessibility information. In 2014, several prominent AAA games included colorblind support, either at launch or through patches. Games like Borderlands 2 and SimCity. And at the same time as this, two big gaming outlets, media outlets, Kotaku and IGN, both publish widely read articles on colorblindness. These two things together resulted in a rapid increase in awareness and consideration over the following years. And this was the first time really that any accessibility consideration in games had approached being a common, let alone standard consideration. To the extent that just 2 years later, it had gone from being a rare novelty to something that players expect. In 2016, a journalist put out an apology piece for failing to mention in their review of a game called The Witness that the game wasn't colorblind accessible. And we've since seen the same thing happen with some other things too. So with options to turn off button mashing, called QTEs, and also with subtitle presentation options as well. So this is features that are progressing from rare to expected within just a couple of years. And a couple of years can be within the development cycle of a single game. So you need to stay ahead of the curve. So if you can do that, stay ahead of that curve, then rather than falling victim to those changing expectations, you can actually be one of the people setting them. Still on the topic of colorblindness, Unreal Engine implemented a colorblindness simulator, which is the first time that an engine, so that is the software framework that developers use to make games with, actually made steps to help developers make their games more accessible. You can expect to see more of that in the future. Also, the Quad Stick launched. This was a SIP puff controller that was actually built upon Ken Yankovic's 30-year legacy of accessible controller development. And an article by Richard Moss went up on a website called The Verge. It was called Why Accessibility Matters. It's still up, you can have a look at it now. This involved a wide range of accessibility advocates, gamers, and developers. Articles like this are pretty common today, but for its time, this was a huge milestone. This article, all these different people from across game development and the community all coming together, is where it really felt like accessibility was becoming a broad, encompassing movement. In 2015 saw the first impact of some legislation called CVAA. It had its impact in the form of the compliance waiver for consoles and networks coming to an end, which meant that any communication functionality in products like a PlayStation or services like Xbox Live must by law be accessible to all kinds of disabilities. This was a key driver for both the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, gaining their initial suites of accessibility functionality in 2015, which continued to grow and evolve way beyond legal compliance over the course of their life cycles, and now on into the current generation of consoles too. After lobbying by the accessibility community led by Barry Ellis, Apple implemented platform-level accessibility functionality to make one-button games like Flappy Birds accessible using external accessibility switches. Accessibility switches are inputs that send a simple on-off signal like a button or a tube to blow into. It's exactly the same tech that the Xbox adaptive controller is designed to be compatible with, and exactly the same technology that Stephen Hawking famously used as well. This made thousands of games accessible to a hugely underserved audience overnight. Also, Evolve became the first AAA game to publish accessibility information on its website. Destiny became the first AAA game to include an accessibility menu. This menu only included 2 options, and separate accessibility menus aren't necessarily a good idea, but for 2015, that was a massive step. 2016 saw the launch of Uncharted 4. This was a AAA title with what, by 2016 standards, was a vast array of accessibility considerations. So you can see their accessibility menu here with camera assists, vehicle camera assists, aim mode, lock on aim, sticks while aiming, repeat button presses, and subtitles. There were extensive publicity efforts around this by PlayStation, which had really significant and direct impact on many other developers across the whole development spectrum, but particularly on AAA developers, those games with the big budgets and big teams. And one of the other big game publishers, the accessibility wave that spread out over the subsequent years, was even actually referred to as the Uncharted effect. Phil Spencer of Xbox was publicly praising this, the head of Xbox publicly praising PlayStation's efforts. This was a sign of things to come, of how accessibility would mean people frequently stepping across traditional barriers to collaborate, both within companies and also between competitors. Also in 2016, able gamers were invited to speak about game accessibility at the White House. PlayStation hosted an accessibility panel at their big consumer event called PSX, and it was their most watched panel of the event. Sean Layden and Phil Spencer, the bosses of PlayStation and Xbox respectively, were making public commitments to accessibility. Karen Stevens at EA was made their full-time accessibility lead. Bryce Johnson and Evelyn Thomas were already working full-time on platform-level accessibility things over at Xbox, but Karen's was the first full-time in-house role working on accessibility of games themselves. Other appointments followed, and now there are about 50 of those dedicated roles. There were several new accessibility hires in the past month alone. So, are you feeling the momentum growing? Part of that momentum was an increasing number of people working on accessibility and an increasing body of professional knowledge and experience. So with 2017 came the first edition of GAconf, which is a conference founded by the IGDA's Accessibility SIG. This quickly expanded and grew into a Europe edition too. Previously, an accessibility talk getting on the lineup at a game development conference just meant a general awareness raiser, like explaining that accessibility is even a thing that exists, and usually only attended by a handful of people. So having this dedicated conference meant a forum for sharing knowledge and experiences at a much deeper level than that, and also having a central hub for people working in the field to come together, network, find collaborators, and get some group therapy. Elsewhere, Microsoft launched their Inclusive Tech Lab in 2017. This was a place for developers in the community to come together and a home for all kinds of fun bits of technology to play with. The Nintendo Switch patched in their first accessibility features. marking the first time in the history of the industry that every major gaming platform, so Switch, Xbox, PS4, Vita, PC, Mac, iOS, Android, all had dedicated system-level accessibility features. And to cap the year off, as part of a fundraising event for special effects, Kim Kardashian tweeted in support of disabled gamers to her 56 million Twitter followers. Two 2018's biggest splash was the arrival of the Xbox Adaptive Controller. It'd been developed over several years, initially in partnership with Warfighter Engaged, who I mentioned earlier, and later with a wide range of charities, specialists, and gamers. I'm sure most of you are at least partially familiar with this now, but at a high level, it is a switch interface, a way to hook up accessibility switches, that range of on-off input devices I mentioned earlier when I was talking about iOS. So you can see in this picture that there are a load of ports along the back of it at the bottom right there. Hooked up to that are a bunch of light touch buttons on the table in front of him, an additional large button mounted next to his cheek. And it also has USB ports to hook up joysticks, as he's doing here as well. This wasn't the first device of its kind. There had actually been many like this before, but it was drastically cheaper, much higher build quality. It looked like a natural part of the Xbox ecosystem, and also the fact that it was Microsoft who built it sent a really powerful statement to the industry. Developing hardware is a pretty strong way of putting your money where your mouth is. There was a ton of other stuff happening in 2018 too. The Can I Play That accessibility review site was founded. EA implemented a dedicated accessibility feedback portal linked to their bug tracking systems, which was soon followed by similar efforts by Mixer, Ubisoft, Warner Brothers, and Blizzard. A game called Celeste launched. The developers of Celeste had seen some discourse around the inflexible design of another game called Cuphead. So in response, the developers of Celeste included a bunch of accessibility assists. This would go on to be as influential a game as Uncharted 4 was, shaping the accessibility mindset of many other developers. And then came the AAAs. So those games are the big teams and big budgets. So back in 2014, a single AAA game, including a single accessibility feature, was huge news, like those games that include colorblind support. In 2016, when Uncharted 4 launched, a single game like that, including a handful of features, was huge news. In 2018, the impact of this was starting to be felt. Some of the AAAs making comparable efforts to Uncharted 4 included Forza Horizon 4, The Crew 2, Spider-Man, Black Ops 4, Starlink, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, State of Decay 2, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Battlefield 5, Sea of Thieves, Madden 19, Monster Hunter World, FIFA 19, God of War, and Red Dead Redemption 2. So that is an absolutely staggering turnaround in just the space of 2 years. Particularly important out of that list was Spider-Man and God of War. These were the top two grossing PS4 games of that year, and both of them had huge critical acclaim. So this conclusively put to bed the myth that accessibility loses money or dilutes creative vision. What you're looking at here is Obama signing in a piece of legislation with a bunch of other people around him, including Stevie Wonder. This was him signing a CVAA into effect, that communications legislation I mentioned earlier. The very first day of 2019 saw the end of CVAA's waiver for games themselves. This means that all games that are released in the USA are now legally obliged to ensure that both chat functionality, like voice chat, text chat, and any chat related information or interfaces are accessible to people with a large range of disabilities. This marked the first time that mainstream games have ever had explicit legal accessibility requirements. And the impact of this has been profound, not just directly, but also spurring development of technologies like text scaling and text-to-speech that are being applied way beyond communication now. CVAA also paved the way for grassroots developers who previously had found it a struggle to be heard. Now, accessibility was a topic that all of their management knew about. And it provided an extra push for people who had been aware of accessibility, but not quite taken the plunge. So now that accessibility was an actual legal requirement for a small aspect of their game, they were running with that, taking that as a cue to also think about how to offer a good gameplay experience to as many players as possible. 2019, it wasn't just about CVAA though. Also this year, Microsoft paid a vast sum of money for an ad spot about the Xbox Adaptive Controller at Super Bowl. Over 100 million people watched it. T-Pain tweeted about it. Cher tweeted about it. Seeing this happen over a Switch interface was just mind-blowing. And elsewhere, able gamers launched their new APX design patterns. Google included accessibility information in the accessibility information and filters in the Stadia store and the Google Play Games app. Accessibility megathreads became a thing. So this is tweets about accessibility issues that receive many thousands of likes and shares and many hundreds of replies. These are powerful. They illustrate demands, they shift mindsets, they raise awareness, and they provide a goldmine of feedback for developers as well. There was a huge uptick in accessibility of events, covering companies like Microsoft, EA, Oculus, Indie Mega Booth, Ubisoft, PlayStation, and Crystal Dynamics at events like E3, GamesCon, XO19, and Paris Games Week. This was companies considering things like ASL, live captioning and audio description for talks, announcements, and broadcasts, and other considerations too, like quiet rooms, braille maps, load tables, and adaptive controllers available on booths. And it was becoming increasingly hard to find a AAA game that didn't include some degree of accessibility considerations, with studios pushing the bar ever higher with games like Division 2 and Gears 5, though still being outstripped by small indies, with Sequence Storm and Eagle Island sitting at the very top of the industry for accessibility, and both of those games were developed by solo indie developers. And then came the I'm Spartacus moment. So in response to gamer tweets claiming that accessibility compromises developers' vision for their games, Corey Barlog of Sony Santa Monica tweeted, "Accessibility has never and will never be a compromise to my vision." Rami Ishmael of Lambir copy-pasted. Many other developers from all across the industry followed suit, either saying the same or adding their own extra detail as to why. And it was, for me, it was this outpouring of support, more than any other recent progress, that was a clear sign that accessibility was now truly a part of the fabric of the games industry. That takes us up to 2020. The big accessibility headline of 2020 was a game called The Last of Us 2. This was by the same developers as Uncharted 4. And when Uncharted 4 came out, it had followed the standard journey. Its feature set was the result of a few people pushing late in development. And then, as they always do, thinking, man, if only we'd have thought this earlier, we could have done so much more and done it so much better. So that's what they did. For The Last of Us 2, they considered accessibility early in development. And the result of that, combined with plenty of user research and working with a range of consultants, was a game that shot the bar way up, including being the first AAA game to be built from the ground up to be fully playable by people who are completely blind. But it was a busy year elsewhere too, for mainstream hardware developers jumping on board with Logitech's adaptive gaming kits, and Hori's equivalent to the Xbox adaptive controller, but for the Nintendo Switch. The launch of the new generation of gaming consoles, which included full controller backwards compatibility for the Xbox Series X and S, meaning you could use your same controllers from older Xboxes, which includes expensive accessibility devices developed for those older consoles. And also a whole swathe of new accessibility goodies for the operating system, the PlayStation 5. And a whole bunch of new resources for both developers and gamers. We saw the arrival of audio description for trailers, which is a separate audio track narrating what is happening visually for people who have difficulty seeing it. And actually, Ubisoft was the first company in any industry to implement YouTube's beta audio description functionality. There was a continued acceleration of the breadth and the depth of considerations in games, from Hypertop to Assassin's Creed Valhalla, from Moving Out to Miles Morales. And this was all capped off at the end of the year by an explosion in accessibility awards, both new dedicated accessibility specific award ceremonies, and also mainstream gaming awards adding categories for accessibility, including the Game Awards. And this is gaming's equivalent of the Oscars. It was watched by over 80 million people. And on into 2021 up to the present day, we've seen progress continue to shoot out in all kinds of directions. In particular from Microsoft, who developed a range of new resources, including an update to their game accessibility guidelines, the launch of a testing service where developers can actually pay for their games to be tested against those guidelines by disabled subject matter experts. They also developed a new resource focused on understanding barriers. That's called Understanding Function to Design for Disabilities. It's not gaming specific. I would really recommend reading that for anyone in any industry. And also last, but by no means least, the Gaming Accessibility Fundamentals Learning Path, which is a completely free game accessibility training course. Lots of new resources from outside of Microsoft too. We've had training and guidelines being made for game creation tools like Roblox and Crater and Unreal. Special effects dev kit resource to help developers design for motor accessibility. PlayStation giving away publicly their internal inclusive language guide. The IGDA Accessibility SIGs new accessibility top 10. A video series of accessibility tips from many cats. EA opening up their accessibility patents and documentation for free use by anyone across the industry. New resources from industry bodies like UKI in the UK, IGEA in Australia and New Zealand, and also the IGDA. South Korea launched a government initiative to produce their own state-backed game accessibility guidelines. And the German government were getting involved too. So they have a government funding program for their games industry. They've now made access to that funding conditional to considering accessibility. We've had an explosion in information for gamers. Xbox and PlayStation both established permanent accessibility showcases in their respective stores, highlighting games that do a good job of accessibility. And they've also both published new accessibility support and information pages too. The Family Video Game Database added accessibility search and filters, and the Accessible Games Database launched. So that lets people search for games based on what accessibility features they have. And the Xbox store did something similar too, also launching their own accessibility tagging system within the store. And developers are making greater efforts to publicize their accessibility work, and not just to tell people, but to do it earlier in development too, which is important because it's hard to get hyped about a game if you don't know whether you'll be able to play it. We've had more progress the platform level itself, Xbox and PlayStation, both building upon the great work they did with the launch of their new platforms. So they're now going further with efforts to add things like Xbox's chat transcription, quick settings menu and visual filters, and also the new Zoom functionality on the PS5. And progress with third-party hardware too. Devices like the Praetorian Game On One and the adaptive cockpit, and in the tools that developers use. So things like the Read Speaker text-to-speech plugin for Unity and Unreal, the Dyslexic Tech Unity plugin, and also, this is really nice to see, work finally beginning on the actual accessibility of the engine development environments themselves to disabled developers. And, of course, progress on the games themselves. At the moment, we're still in the immediate aftermath of The Last of Us 2, and because of the timescales involved in AAA development in particular, it's still taken another year or two for the impact of that game and other studios to be fully felt in games hitting release. But that momentum that's been building in those AAAs over the past couple of years has continued to build. In particular, with games like Ratchet and Clank, Forza Horizon 5, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Far Cry 6, in some ways surpassing things that The Last of Us 2 achieved. And lots of other AAAs have been doing good things too, from Biomutant to Returnal, from FIFA to Psychonauts 2, from Horizon Forbidden West to Life is Strange for True Colors. It really is at the point now where you simply cannot release a AAA game without having a solid accessibility foundation. You can't afford to be that far behind what all of your contemporaries and all of your competitors are doing. Player expectations have now shifted too far. And with the kind of things that are currently in development today, that shift is only going to increase. And you can see the impact here from this IGN headline. Deathloop's lack of accessibility options is disappointing players. I and many other disabled players won't be able to play this game. This is not the kind of publicity that you want around the launch of your game. And indies have been knocking it out of the park in greater numbers than ever before too. And this is in no small part because of the continuing influence of Celeste and its various progeny. So just a few of the recent indie successes that I'd recommend checking out are Chicory, Horror Tales, The Wine, Sunblaze, Twilight Drive, The Big Con, Severed Steel, Skatebird, Rainbow Billy, Unsighted, and The Veil. So I hope this is giving you a sense of the exponential curve that progress is now shooting along. The years ahead only have ever greater things to come. And this isn't happening by accident. This is happening due to people. The mugshots that you're looking at on the screen now are some of the people in new full-time in-house game accessibility roles. Over a dozen appointments in the past year alone, pushing the total up past 50 at companies like Xbox, PlayStation, Ubisoft, Bethesda, EA, Amazon, Unity. But this presents a problem. And that problem is a skills shortage because good people are very quickly being snapped up. The demand is now outstripping supply. So I'm going to end this talk with a call to action. If you know accessibility, the games industry needs you. And while a company's first hire needs to be someone with solid game accessibility experience, the successive hires often don't. Some of the accessibility roles recently and soon to be advertised include program manager, software engineer, web accessibility, project manager. These are roles open to people from other industries, and the games industry could really, really benefit from diverse experiences gleaned from companies in other industries. So if you've ever thought that working in the game development industry might appeal to you, now is the time. Opportunities are opening up. Your experience and expertise is needed to help games reach their full potential, to ensure that both gamers and developers can benefit from all that making games accessible has to offer. And just a couple of links to finish on. The first has some nice insight both into pre-2010 and more detail on what's happened recently too. That's tinyurl.com/game accessibility history. The second contains a handy bunch of links covering pretty much all you could ever want to know about accessibility. That one is igda-gasig.org/how/for-developers-researchers. And last, my contact details. You can reach me on Twitter at @IanHamilton_ or on email i_h@hotmail.com. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ian. Fantastic presentation. Really appreciate it. I learned a lot. We've got a really great and active chat channel here. Folks agreeing with you on your praises of Chicory. A lot of other information sharing. The family gaming database with taminggaming.com. Yep. Yeah, let's see. Mentions of Spitfire, mentions of caniplaythat.com, the children's games, BBC resources. So really great additional resources. Thanks everybody for sharing those.
Yes, I'm glad somebody mentioned BBC. BBC were early pioneers. They were as far as I'm aware, the first game publisher to actually implement internal game accessibility standards and guidelines back like 10 years ago. They've done a lot of good work, and that's spread out from other places from there as well, including myself. That's where I got my accessibility experience from working at BBC on the kids' games.
Awesome. All right, so I've got a fair number of questions here. Again, folks, put your questions in the Q&A section and upvote or thumbs up the ones that you want to make sure that we have time to get to. So the most popular question right now, Ian, is what are your thoughts on decoupling accessibility from difficulty?
You can't decouple accessibility from difficulty. So we need to look at what difficulty and accessibility are, and for that you need to take a step back and look at what disability is. Disability is a mismatch between someone's capability and a barrier they're encountering. Difficulty is the relationship between someone's capability and the barriers that a game presents. And accessibility means removing unnecessary mismatch between those two things. So even though the words difficulty and accessibility don't mean exactly the same thing, they are very, very closely interlinked. You can't change difficulty without changing accessibility, and vice versa. That's the entire point of accessibility, is avoiding this excess difficulty that mismatch presents, right? So if you want a slightly longer answer, there is a 6-minute video. If you type in Ian Hamilton difficulty accessibility into YouTube, you will get that up.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Okay, next most popular question. Do you know of any games where users can use voice control as their main form of control in play?
Yeah, there's a couple of different angles on that. There's games that are designed specifically for that. So I've seen some fun things come out of game jams, in particular, more experimental games that have done things like that. It's like an anger-based game where you kill people around you by shouting. So there's been some interesting experiments like that. There have been some games that are designed to have partial voice controls. So like Skyrim. In Skyrim, you have the option of executing your spells either by the usual button prompts or actually like saying the magic words to do the spell. And the other angle to it is voice controls through third-party tools. So things like voice attack, where you can actually remap in-game commands to voice inputs. That's quite popular in things like space flight sims. So it's basically feels like you're in Star Trek or something, giving you voice controls, right? But there's also people who play solely using voice controls. So that game I mentioned earlier called Celeste, which was a Mario style platformer, they're very difficult and precise. There's actually someone I know who plays that solely using voice commands through mapping. Like he actually says the word jump, that'll make his character jump because he's mapped that to the jump button, that kind of thing. And that game is an interesting example for accessibility, that player in particular, because that game is intended to be very hard. It's supposed to take a lot of trial and error and repeated attempts to basically like succeed through persistence. And that game actually includes options to crank the game speed right down, options to give yourself infinite boosts, and even an option to make yourself invincible. So a lot of people kind of instinctively think that if you're including those kind of things, that is going against the designer's intent, right? If you're making yourself invincible and moving in slow motion, that must be ruining the idea of success through persistence. But actually, this guy who plays with voice commands, for him, playing on the default settings is impossible, because playing by those voice commands is, I'm sure you can imagine, quite unwieldy and laborious way to interact. Anyway, before you take into account the like unpredictable amount of lag there is on your voice inputs and stuff as well. But actually, by enabling the slow motion, by enabling the invincibility, he can actually play. But even with those things involved, it is really difficult. It still takes him a lot of tries to get through every single level. So through actually making himself invisible and in slow motion, he is actually making the game hard. He's actually giving himself the exact experience that developers intended. And that's reflected in the way they've gone about the wording for those features as well. They started off by saying, like, you know, the intended experience is playing without these features. They actually found that didn't work, because actually discouraging people from playing at all, because he wants to not get the intended experience. So once they realized this, they actually worded it saying that Celeste is supposed to be a challenging and rewarding experience. If the default settings don't work for you, we hope that these assists will actually let you have that challenging, rewarding experience and stuff.
Excellent. Thanks, Ian. I think you touched on this a little bit, but it might be worth repeating. So this question is, as someone who's working on an indie game with a team, do you have any resources for accessibility guidelines for games?
Yes, that link that's up there on the screen at the moment, the for developers and researchers, that has a section of that page which is just about guidelines. There's a ton. So you can just basically flick through those and find whichever set of guidelines best suits your way of thinking, your way of working. In particular, if you're just getting started and want something that is easy to get into, if you look in that page for the GAsig top 10, that is kind of 10 broad questions to ask yourself about your mechanics. So that's a nice starting point and way in.
Great, thank you. Okay,
also, if you're working with the game as well, I'd also have a look at your debug options. That's a nice trick you can do if you're working to a shoestring budget, is you might actually have a lot of stuff in there that is actually useful accessibility accommodations that developers just turn off and hide when they go to launch their game. But you might find some things in there that you can just put some interface on instead.
Excellent. Can you speak a bit about how to work with time constraints, timing out, giving the user more time to complete a task would level the playing field? And they say, pun intended.
Yes. So timing, yeah. So there was an interesting one with Celeste actually letting you reduce the overall speed of the game. That's something that was very rare up until a few years ago, but now is actually starting to spread quite a bit, and even now into the biggest AAA games. So both Ratchet and Clank and Forza Horizon 5, two of the biggest games in the past year, both actually have that ability to just slow down the entire game. It's also done on a smaller level as well. So some things that let you just slow time down temporarily. And also for very specific mechanics. So for example, the quick time events that I mentioned earlier, like where you have to just like hammer a button really quickly, actually reducing the timing demand of that down. Some games just let you skip those mechanics completely. But one thing I liked was, approach that I liked was in Red Dead Redemption 2. Red Dead Redemption 2 actually allows you to configure the timing demands of that game. So rather than just turn off those mechanics, it actually gives you a slider for how frequently you have to mash the button. So just in case you are one of those few people who does enjoy frantically mashing a button, but can't quite do it, it lets you configure it a bit so you can still have access to that mechanic just in the way that better suits your needs.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ian. Okay. I think we can fit maybe one more question in here. How about this one? Many games have come under fire for being released buggy or unplayable, let alone accessible. How can, should, or does accessibility get prioritized when even that happens?
It's a question of what stage of development you think about it. It's as simple as that. Like I said, the Last of Us 2, the difference between The Last of Us 2 and Uncharted 4 was because they thought about it from the start. And that meant that they implemented 60 accessibility considerations rather than 6. So it's to the point where you can actually, if you think about it early enough, can do some things basically for free. I say basically because there is always a little bit of a cost in terms of knowledge acquisition, the time you took to actually even learn about this stuff, but in terms of actual development costs, you can do stuff even for free. So a classic example of that being like text size. If you are in a situation which quite a lot of games have been in recently, because text size is by far the most common accessibility complaint in games. The situation where a few games that have been in recently of launching, getting a load of feedback from players, because once it launches, that's the first time a game is actually seen in a living room environment. That's when people realize the text is too small. And then having to go back in and try and rework the text size, that is horrendous. It's not like working on a website or something. You've got like a fixed size screen with fixed size containers, all that kind of stuff. So an example of a game that did actually go back and patch it in was The Outer Worlds. And that took them 3 months of solid work to be able to fix that tiny text size. Whereas if you decide from the very start of development, before you even design any UI, okay, I'm not going to use tiny text. That's it, you've done the work, So there's a lot that can boil down to just simple design decisions like that. And even things that aren't free are generally a lot easier and a lot cheaper earlier in development. And it's also helpful if you can get away as much as possible from thinking about it in terms of items on the backlog, and try and think of it instead in terms of success criteria on the other backlog items. So rather than having an item of like make the mini map colorblind accessible, which can then be prioritized against other things, instead on your backlog item for designing the UI for the mini map, the success criteria of that is this colorblind accessible? That can't be done for everything, but the more you can push towards that kind of thing, the easier it makes those kind of discussions.
Fantastic, Ian. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and resource sharing. It's been excellent. Everybody that tuned in, thank you so much for the resource sharing and chat and questions. Really appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you, especially Ian.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for watching.